Hi, everyone. Okay, you should be able to hear me. We're gonna start. Are you guys seeing the screens? You can just put a thumb up as well if you're seeing the full screen, just to confirm. All right. Okay, so good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. For those of you who are not here and don't know me, I'm Stéphanie Périquet-Pearce. I'm a wildlife ecologist here at the Ongava Research Center, and my focus is actually on large carnivores. So for those of you who joined today thinking that I would be talking about spiders, waterfalls, or snakes, I am very sorry to disappoint you. You can leave us right now. I will be talking about none of those. And I will definitely be talking about carnivores and the crucial roles that they play in preserving healthy ecosystem. Contrary to the usual, I will not be presenting any of my results or my collaborators and student results. We're actually not even going to speak about Africa, or I'll try to do my best not to talk about Africa. But it's basically a seminar that is going to take us through history and basically how we came to discover the importance of apex predators in ecosystem. Sadly, we mostly learn from the disappearance and the consequences that it has on ecosystem functioning. This is mainly broadly based on a book that is entitled "Where the Wild Things Were," written by William Stolzenberg. I highly recommend you to read it. I would recommend that you wait until next week or the end of this week until part 2 of the seminar. So then you don't ruin the surprise, even though I don't give details on every single topic that is in the book. So you will still definitely learn some more things in the book. So for most of us that are joining today, most probably the concept of keystone species or trophic cascade is something that we toy with on a daily basis. But for the purpose of the seminar, I'm going to ask you to pretend, if you can, that those concepts don't exist and that you never heard of them, because basically we're going to walk along those ecologists and biologists who put those concepts on the map. So this is only part 1. Part 2 will be on Thursday. So you will see me or hear me again on Thursday. But let's dive in. So the part 1 is going to be about carnivores and how we came to discover that they are keystone species, how we define those terms, and the importance that they play in ecosystem. And part 2 will be on the consequences of the extension and extirpation from ecosystem. So all of this is quite dull and sad, but fortunately there's some silver lining. So we'll also talk about restoration and rewilding. But today is about part 1. So we'll cover the concept of food web, bottom-up, top-down processes, and trophic cascade. So it all started actually in 1921 or in the 20s with Charles Estens, who was a biologist, American, and he was sent to the Spitsbergen in the Barents Sea. So that's north of the Scandinavian countries in Europe. And this is basically what it looks like. So for people who are working with me in Africa, this looks very, very foreign. It is indeed. So that's basically flat plain of tundras, no trees, no bushes. Everything grows very close to the ground. The growing season obviously is very short because the winter are long and very serious. And then in the center of the island, you have mountains most of the year covered with snow. So it's actually quite a bleak place, even during the summer, where it's get a bit greener, but not so much. Probably the color scheme looks a bit like Namibia at the moment, which is quite dull and brown. In terms of wildlife and mammals, we're talking about reindeer, which is the main ungulates, and the main carnivore, as in the most common carnivore, is the Arctic fox. You've got here the Arctic fox in winter, and then in summer. There are some polar bears as well, but you can guess that there's not so many of them. But I would be damned if I don't talk about actually the bird life, which is wildlife as well. And those guys are actually the most abundant animals on the islands. And they basically feed at sea and come to roost in the cliffs over the tundra or over the steep slope on the island. And so what is generally a really brown and gray tundra just turns into very lush green grass and saxifrages under the cliff. And now Elton is looking at that and he's starting to wonder, but what is it? Why is it so green like this under those cliffs? And when Elton is asking these questions, there is no concept of food web. So what we know is basically the world is fixed. It is how it is. It's an assemblage of animals and of plant lives. And what drives those associations and what drives life is actually the abiotic environment. So the rock, the soil, the temperature, the wind, all of those kind of things. So microclimate. And Elton decides to just have a look and check what's the microclimate in those green areas. And he finds nothing, as in nothing different from anywhere else on the tundra. It's just the same temperature, the same sea salt in the air. Everything is the same. And as you look up on the cliffs, and as you can hear as well, there is thousands of birds nesting there. And usually, as every animal does, after eating, the birds poop. And the guano just dribbles down the cliffs and reach the bottom of the cliff. And surprise, surprise, this is all green. And this is the first time that someone thinks, well, maybe there is actually a transfer of nutrient actually from the sea through the birds back to the island and then having the vegetation basically fertilized. And what Elton actually writes in his own world is it's actually a world of rather unstable population in an unstable environment and not a static arrangement of animals that are limited to habitats created chiefly by plants and vegetation with its special microclimate. So that was published in a monograph, kind of a book actually, called Animal Ecology in 2007. And right there and then the concept of food web was born. That was the first time that someone linked animal to the vegetation, actually animal having an impact on vegetation. This is what we know of food webs today, or barely how we represent them. So we represent them as a pyramid. At the bottom, we've got the decomposers who basically eat or process dead matter, whether it's plant or animal. And then we've got the producers. We can have primary, secondary producer, which is basically plants, either terrestrial or algae. And then we've got different type of consumers, primary, secondary, tertiary. We can probably subdivide as much as we want, depending on which animals we're working on. But the concept basically is that the energy flows up and down. So from the plants that eat the sunlight to the herbivores that eat the plants to the carnivores that eat the herbivores. And until we reach basically an animal that has no enemy. You notice here that I use the concept enemy in a quotation mark because this is the word from Elton. This is how he used it and defined it. Today we would call probably predator. But basically whatever is not eaten by anything else is at the top of the food chain until it dies and then it's eaten by the decomposer from the very bottom of it. And from this comes the concept of an ecological niche, right? This is basically an animal's place in the biotic environment, and it's its relation to its food and its enemy, so its predators. One thing that is important to notice here is it's a pyramid, right? I mean, it's obvious for us, but back in the days, it was not. It's not a square, it's not a rectangle, it's not a circle, and it's not a cycle. And the fact that it's a pyramid is very important because each layer of the pyramid has a different width. And that width basically represents the diversity of species that can be found in that level of the trophic chain or the food web. And as well, the number of individuals that can be found on a species. So the width is the number of species and the number of individuals, many more individual trees or grass plants than lions or tigers, for instance. So now we have an understanding that everything is linked to each other, and we start from the bottom, basically, plants, prey, predator. So obviously now the big question is, but really, what controls that pyramid? Because if there is energy flow and relationship between all those layers, there needs to be control somewhere. And then this is where we get to Gregory Gause in the 30s. So that's basically 10 years after Elton's been to the Spitsbergen, 3 years after he published his Animal Ecology. And what Gause has over any large mammal ecologist is he can work with his subject in test tubes. That is something that a lot of us working with large mammal wish we could do. Just because, well, it's very convenient, it's a small environment, it's very controllable, cycles are very quick, so we can have a lot of data in a very short amount of time. Fortunately, most of us here are not so lucky. But ghosts back in the day decided to test what was controlling the pyramid using microorganism, and that's using harmless bacteria paramecium and a predatory protozoa didinium. And what happens when you put those two together, didinium attached to paramecium, and basically eats it and phagocytes it. So that's it, that's the end of paramecium. So what ghost did is in a test tube, he just put paramecium and didinium together and he waited. And after a while, didinium consumed all the paramecium, and well, eventually dies because, well, there's nothing else to eat. So the predator consumes all the prey and dies of starvation. Then goes on the idea, what if actually I provide refuge to paramecium to hide from the predator? So this is in the form of sediment. Basically, the paramecium can go and hide in there. Same experiment. And well, after a while, didinium consumes all the non-eaten paramecium, dies out. And a couple of days later, the paramecium can now leave its refuge and then overtake the whole ecosystem and eventually dies out as well, because even though it's a prey, it needs food, and then food is wholly consumed. So now it goes as another idea. So, okay, what I would need to control that, that explosion of paramecium is just simply add didinium, right, as some part of the system. So it's not the experiment the exact same way, except that at the point where didinium has now died because it consumed all the non-eaten paramecium, it adds a few live didinium. So the paramecium population has recovered, has exploded, and with the addition of the didinium, then is basically brought down again, and then again adds the didinium. And we hit a system where basically we observe oscillations between the number of prey and predator. For those of you who like, well, not equations, fortunately, but graphs, this is how it looks like. In the first experiment, we basically have the prey that takes over the system, predator gets in, eats all the prey, and dies off of starvation. In the second experiment, the predator dies off, but there was some prey that remained, that managed to stay alive in a refuge and then quickly overtake the system. Eventually, that curve is also going to crash down and the prey is going to die. And in the third experiment that is just in the background, we have oscillation between prey population going up, predator population going up as well, consuming more and more prey. That leads the prey population to go down, which lead the predator population to go down. And then it's just an endless cycle. That is something that is called today a bottom-up process. So basically, the prey control the predator population. So that's the bottom layers that exert control on the top layer. That is something that today most of us are very familiar with. That's what we call the Lotka-Volterra equation. This is what is represented there. Lotka and Volterra actually came about those equations independently and separately, and they published in the same year. Volterra published in Nature, lucky him. And so today they are actually named the Lotka-Volterra equation. Well, that's all good, but that's in a test tube, right? So is it the truth in natural live-scale environment? Well, the most famous example is the one with snowshoe hare and Canadian lynx, when we observe boom of population in the snow hare and then crashes as the lynx population also booms, and then in response to the lack of prey, population of lynx goes down, and we in those big cycles. So it seems that the bottom-up processes are pretty important because the prey can indeed control the predator. But for a few people, it was definitely not enough. And then come Harrison, Smith, and Slobodkin with the HSS phenomenon. So that's basically the first letter of their names. And they just came up with a crazy idea. That was the green world hypothesis. And they advanced that maybe the land is green, so there's still vegetation around, because herbivores are kept from eating everything from the predators. They're basically eaten out from the top, so they can't eat everything. So they set out on looking of examples of that green world hypothesis in the world, and they came across lesson learned from the Kaibab Plateau that was in the 20s. So the HSS phenomenon is in the 60s, so 40 years later, they revisit data from the Kaibab Plateau, which is in Arizona in the States, just north of the Grand Canyon. So this is basically how it looks like. You've got the canyon at the bottom, and on top, you've got plateaus that are more or less isolated, which means that whatever you do on top of a plateau will take some time to recover, because immigration, it will be very slow to happen because of just the topography of the place. And the Kaibab deer incident has actually been quite popular in textbook. It's made it to textbook because of the green world hypothesis. Then it was highly criticized and taken down because it was said that the scientists who worked on it grossly overestimate the numbers. And 10 years later, it was just reestablished in the textbook because it was said that the scientists who said that the number was grossly overestimated actually grossly underestimated the numbers. Anyhow, the point is that the KBAB actually was declared a game preserve in 1906. And back in the days, what we want to preserve was obviously prey. And so predators were eradicated between 1907 and 1923. So trappers, hunters, basically every single predator was shot or trapped or poisoned or anyhow do without. In parallel, the mule deer number, which is the main deer species there, rose from nearly 4,000 in 1906 to over 100,000 in 1924. So that's actually a huge and quick response. After that, so 6 years, a bit more, almost 10 years after the last predator has been eradicated, we observed a huge mass mortality event, which left basically less than 12,000 deers alive on the plateau. And people started to wonder, well, what actually happened there? So they looked at fire, they look at vegetation growth, they look at very, very hard winters, but nothing really was fitting in. And some people starting to look a bit closely at the vegetation. And you have here one of the park rangers standing next to trees. And that's a tree topography that most of us are used to. If you live in an area where there is livestock, is that there is, top of the trees is green, so it's kind of not browsed, up to a certain height, and under that, every leaf is just, well, not there anymore. So that is the maximum height that a deer can access on a tree. So and everything that a deer could possibly get his teeth on, they did. And the main explanation then for that mass mortality event is basically the die of mass starvation because, well, they overgrazed. They ate everything they could. There was nothing else to eat, nothing to keep the mule deer numbers in check. And then there you go. So kind of a top-down process with the predator, actually the disappearance of a predator leading to another population of prey, basically eventually dying off. So that's all fun and good, but the problem is it's observation data. So that is correlation, and it's very often the best we can do when we work with large mammal, but unfortunately, this is not the best way to demonstrate what has an effect on what. And so here come Robert's pain, and now Payne's won't have it, and he decides, no, we need to actually experiment and check that out. So in 1963, he is a biologist in the States, again, in Mocow Bay, in Washington's Olympic Peninsula. So that is basically the northwestern part of the States. And as he's walking down the beaches there, he's looking at tidal pools. And those tidal pools harbor a very diverse marine ecosystem and marine communities of invertebrates, including the stars of the show, the blue mussels, and the ORC sea stars, which is the top predator in that area. You can see there is also some anemones, there's a lot of crustacean and other clams, but the key here is really the mussels and the sea star. And now Payne's decide, well, what if I remove the predator from the ecosystem and see what it does? So the good thing with sea stars is you can just walk around. I mean, walk around, it's a bit slippery there and the water is cold, but you can just grab them and throw them back at sea. So in terms of ethics, that might be debatable, but definitely not as debatable as killing them. So every month, Payne goes there, and in adjacent pools, in one pool, he just leaves as is. And the other pool, he just systematically remove every sea starfish that he can find, and he leaves the other one as is. What happened is basically in the undisturbed tidal pool, everything is proceeding well as is. But in the pools where the main predator has been removed, the mussels have completely overtaken the system, which means that there is actually zero biodiversity in there. There's just one species. So the removal of the starfish, the main predator, leads to an explosion of mussels, which eventually just takes over and destroys the whole biodiversity in the system. And there you have it. That's a nice, clean experimental demonstration of the top-down processes. So up to now, we've seen that there's bottom-up processes that occurs from the bottom to the top, sorry. And now there's top-down control. And in the word of pain, basically the top-down control is the fact that local species diversity is directly related to the efficiency with which predators prevent the monopolization of a major environmental requisites by one species. And with that, we also have the concept of a keystone species. So that is coming from architecture, keystone in an archway. If you remove that stone, the whole archway basically just comes crashing down. That is the stone that keeps everything together. In the context of biology, basically it's removed those keystone species from the archway of life, and the whole structure comes crashing down. So this is a concept that we need to be careful on, because it's very easy for everybody to just define their species as keystone. So we need to look at the broader picture, and it's not just keystone for you, for your research or for your funding, but it's also keystone in terms of really what is the role of that species in the environment. Now, the great thing about science, and this is one of the reasons why I am a scientist, is because as soon as we get some answers, well, guess what? We've got new questions. And so all of these answers now, we got a lot of new questions. The first one is, well, which predator actually matters? Which species are keystone species and which are not? Is it true? Is it happening? Those bottom-up and top-down processes, are they happening everywhere, in every ecosystem? Or is it just on the seashore? And all of these answers and questions basically lead the world to wake up to the importance of predators in ecosystem and the role they play in regulating or at least affecting their prey and everything that's underneath. And this is where we get to one of the most famous experiment, or not experiment, actually, it was an observation as well, but kind of a natural experiment from James Estes in the 70s. So now we 10 years later than the Green World hypothesis. And he works in the Aleutian Islands, which are basically between Russia and Alaska. Sorry, we're still by the seashore. It's still very cold sea. So we're still not getting to land yet with all those hypotheses. And he works with something very cute, which are otters, sea otters. And sea otters have basically been decimated by the fur trade. And unfortunately for them, in 1741, a ship got stranded on one of those islands. And eventually, well, the cruise ship finds themselves with nothing to eat, and they decide to kill some otters. And not only are they tasty and fatty and provide a lot of nutrient, but they realize that their fur is of exceptionally good quality. It's very soft, and it's also very dense because, well, the otter actually live in a very cold sea. And after that, that leads to a huge fur trade, to the point that by 1911, about 500,000 to 1 million of otters have been killed for their fur and are nowhere to be found on those islands. They slowly recolonized in the 60s, and in the 70s, by the time Estes arrived on those islands, they are really doing quite well. At the time as well, other species have already disappeared and are nowhere to be seen. They're actually extinct today, like the spectacled cormorant and the Steller's sea cows. They've all been basically killed out, hunted out during the fur trade. And as Estes is studying those otters, he realized that not only they're very cute, but they eat virtually everything they can get their paws on. So there's going to be clams, going to be crab, it's going to be shrimps. They're carnivores, obviously. And once in a while, they, well, also observe eating hurricanes. And from his tidal pool experiment, Payne has actually shown that in the tidal pool with urchins populations, overpopulation, there was no kelp. So there seems to be a link between urchin and kelp. Urchin actually eat the kelp. And so when there's a lot of urchins, the kelp forests are disappearing. And since now Estes has observed otters eating urchin, he wonders, could the otter be affecting the kelp forest? So what it does, he goes and compare islands with and without otters. It would have been difficult to remove the otters, probably not ethical. Also, otters are much cuter than starfish, so he probably had a problem. So he used basically a natural experiment without predators. And what he found, and was published in 1974 in Science, is that on islands where there is no otters, there is urchins everywhere and no kelp inside. That's about it. That is just a sea floor that is ruled by urchin. However, when the otters are present, not only there is kelp, but there is all the biodiversity and marine community that is associated to the kelp forest. So fish, crustacean, and other like seals, and all those kind of species that actually thrive in an environment with a kelp forest. So a whole very complex and dynamic community. And there, right there and then, was born the concept of trophic cascade. Trophic cascade shows that basically an animal in a layer of the food web can not only influence the layer that is just underneath it, but also all the layers underneath. So that is the concept at the same time of a keystone species. So we like to say that the trophic cascade is basically the fact that the effect of a keystone species has on one level ripples through the whole food web and gets all the way down to the bottom layer of that food web. But no, that was too beautiful to be true. And trouble is lurking. So in the 90s, 20 years after Estes has first landed in the Aleutian Island and has been working on them, he's now an emeritus professor. He's got all his students doing his fieldwork for him, which is the big curse of our profession. And so he's still very much involved in there. There's been following the otter population, marking them individually. And in 20 years, the otter population is fast declining with absolutely no sign of malnutrition or disease. There is nobody's otter bodies washing up on the streets. When otter die, usually they float because thanks to their amazing fur, and they can't find anybody's. There is just nothing. The otters are just simply disappearing. And well, killer whales have been observed hunting them on several islands. That starts in 1993 when one of Estes' students observed an otter swimming back frantically from a pod of orcas, wounded, and just basically seeks refuge in the kelp forest, and is clearly getting attacked by those orcas. When Hatfield reports that to Estes, it's just like, nah, that's just, I mean, yeah, okay, that happens, but I mean, a pod of what, 4 orcas would explain the disappearance, like a 50% drop in an otter population? Unlikely. Let's look somewhere else. Problem is 1 year later, another student reports now the orcas hunting an otter, that otter diving, trying to avoid the predator, and just only to never be seen again. So now suddenly, well, we have a proof that orca kind of are killing otters, and Estes is still no closer to find a reason why otter population would be declining so fast. And I start to ponder. And at that time as well, the island that they were working on in 1994, they have to leave because the naval base, the American base, is actually closing down. And so they moved the field station to an island nearby, the Adak Island. And that's the exact same story. So that's just not something that happens on one island. So Estes now is open to actually asking the question, well, could killer whale be responsible for the otter decline, even though he doesn't really believe it? As a good scientist, it's like, well, that is a valid question. We should look into it and hopefully discard it. And if it's the case, then why now? Why would killer whale suddenly prey on otter? Because that decrease has just been in the 20 past years. And before that, the otter population were doing just fine. From there, we need to take a step back and look a bit at killer whales, or orcas, biology. That is one of the largest living predators on the planet, 7 to 10 meters long, up to 6 tons. So if we don't consider the whales as predators, or if we consider predator eating something a bit bigger than krill, then orca is definitely the biggest predator. Originally, it was not named killer whale. It was named whale killer, because orcas can kill whale, not only the small one, humpback whale, if we consider that as small, but also the blue whale and even sperm whale. So they are definitely equipped to kill whale. They prey on virtually anything they encounter. I can't remember where, but I read somewhere that actually if you compare the teeth of an orca to your teeth of a Tyrannosaurus rex, it's actually very different. They're very difficult to make the difference. So whatever they can grab and eat, they will. They have a very fast metabolism due to the fact that they live most of the time in very cold water. So they need to eat about 5% of their body weight each day. So that's about just shy of 300 kilograms of meat per day for one orca. All right. So now Estes does the math. If we have 4 orcas, how many otters can they eat in a year? Well, it turns out that actually less than 4 orcas could explain the decline in the otter population, because over the years, they would have easily consumed 40,000 otters. So just 4 killer whales, enough to cause a decline in the otter population, if that is the case. But that is something now the hypothesis still holds. And then on the attack island, there is the Clam Lagoon that is protected by a sandbank, which basically makes the approach from the sea very, very shallow and prevents the killer whale from accessing the lagoon. On that lagoon, guess what? Well, the otter population is doing quite well. It's actually flourishing. It's at carrying capacity. There is no disease. There is no malnutrition. It's still otter paradise in there. So that's here another break in the wall that maybe orcas actually could be responsible for the decline of otters. That is again published in 1998 in the journal Science, basically linking killer whales to the disappearance of otters, and then everything that comes after that. So the Burmese urchin population, the disappearance of kelp forest, and you have it. So this is where we stand right now. We have a decline in sea otter, and then clearly they might be due, or very likely due, to predation by killer whales. But we still have a question. Why suddenly would the killer whale switch to otters? There is no reason, especially because otters are a very low reward food item. It's very small for an orca that needs to eat nearly 300 kilograms of meat per day. In parallel, so Estes starts to look at what's happening in the ocean system. And in parallel to that, there's been an observed decline of seals and sea lion population. So that's prior to that decline of otter. The consensus is for that decline is basically because of the fishing industry that's been overfishing, which led to fish stock crash, poor nutrition, and then the seals and sea lion declining. And that is the consensus. This is accepted. This is fact. This is what we think at that time. But Estes is not someone to be stopped by what we think we know. And he's still asking, but wait a minute, what if seals and sea lions will actually feed themselves? And what happened to them is the exact same thing that what happened to otters. So he's not dismissing the fact that, yeah, fisheries might have a role in this, but maybe there is something more to it. And well, that would mean that basically whales switch to otters because the decline of their main prey, which, why would it be so sudden? Most probably because they also switch to seals and sea lions, which means that those guys are actually not the main prey of orcas. And then same question again, why suddenly would orcas switch to an alternate prey? And here comes us. And before the decline of sea lions and seal populations, what happened is that the great whale population has been declining sharply because of whaling. In those days, the World War II is just behind us, and there's a lot of vessels that are fully armed, huge, with sonar, capable of basically roaming the seas with high efficiency, and they have been converted to whaling boats. And we've been whaling and whaling and whaling, causing clear decrease in the whaling population. So the idea is basically a sequential collapse. We collapse the great whale, and then the sea harbor, and then the fur seals, and then the sea lions and the sea otter. And then by causing the decline of the main prey, we force killer whales to switch from smaller and smaller and smaller prey. This published, was published in the Proceeding of National Academy of Science in 2003. I don't know how you feel about that, but for me, 2003 is yesterday. I mean, it's not really, it's 21 years ago, but it really, like, it's recent. It's not like from the 20s or the 50s. We're just still very fresh on that discovery. This paper could have been published in Science. When it was submitted, it came back twice to the authors. And the first return was really encouraging. That was minor revision. This is great. We support you. Just submit a revision and that should go okay. And then when they resubmit, to their surprise, it came back with straight refusal, straight rejection. And even one of the reviewer basically stated, we all know that Steller sea lions starve to death. That's a fact. So that was the lobbying at the moment. That was the main hypothesis. At the time, actually, it was not an hypothesis. It was well known. And after that, quite literally, quite a few of those authors of the papers from that was submitted to Science jumped ship. And they were basically lobbied and pressured to not press onto this idea that actually the collapse of the sea lions could have been caused by whaling. And they were accused of letting the fishermen off the hook, and now fisheries is going to just go and exploit the seas again. And now people are going to start to shoot killer whales to provoke a rebound in the seal and sea lions population. And they were actually just ran hellfire on those guys who were actually, if you read the title well, just asking a question. Could that be possible? The evidence is quite overwhelming. We know now that actually whaling has definitely had huge effect. And this is highly likely that our overwhaling basically triggered a chain reaction in there. If we push it, we know that also the decline in sea otter will most likely lead to an increase in urchin population, which will lead to a collapse in kelp forest. So all the way from whaling, so from us, whaling affecting the killer whales, which is the top predator in that ecosystem, and from the killer whale, we basically have the collapse of kelp forest. So that's basically an ecological chain reaction. At this stage, as Estes sees, it says it's time to recognize that carnivorous animals are important, and we have to stop thinking of them as passengers of this earth and start thinking of them as drivers. And why drivers? Well, because of the top-down effect that they exert on the ecosystem they live in. That is it for me today. That's the end of part 1. And I'm just gonna shut up because I already spoke way too long, and I'm gonna listen to your question. Thank you very much.